that will be assisting you throughout the workshop. We also have Steph and MJ who are available for technical support if you're having any difficulties or have any additional questions. Before I introduce you to our panel, there are a few webinar etiquette rules I'd like to go through. Because we have a bigger group, please have your mic muted unless you are asking a question or if it is a group breakout session. We would love to see your faces and it helps the presenters connect with the audience. Please keep your video on if you can with your internet bandwidth. There are two features for you to ask questions or provide comments. The Q&A section is for questions you have for the speaker. The chat feature is available on the right-hand side menu for you to get technical support. I will be watching the Q&A board, so you don't have to, so don't worry about your questions being missed. I'll watch for them. The session is being recorded and will be available for you to watch again until September 2021. I'm excited to introduce you to our moderator for this session, Isha Khan. Isha is the CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Isha.
Good afternoon, everyone, or morning, depending on where some of you are. Happy to be with you all today, and I'm speaking to you from Treaty 1 territory, which is also, the Red River Valley is also the homeland of the Métis, and the water here at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, where I am, and in our surrounding area is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. So always important to start with acknowledgement of our place on this land and our relationship with Indigenous people, and particularly because today we talk about moving forward together and finding ways of working together. And I know that you'll hear from our panelists that relationships and how we approach issues, or what we think are issues, is important. So just a couple of things in addition to what you just heard from Layla. We're going to really hope to have a bit of a conversation today. So we've got a bit of an idea of how to engage in a conversation. So I may ask some questions. There's a chat function. There may be questions. We'll try to use all of those and make sure that everyone has a chance to get in there a little bit. I'm going to turn it to our two panelists, both Heather Walken and Yuta Treviranus. I should have checked how to say your name, Yuta, ahead of time, are both members of the Inclusive Design and Accessibility Committee of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. But they're here because they are experts in their fields and they have thoughtful and important information to share. I'll just turn to both of you. I'll start with you, Heather. Your bios, I know, are up in the program for everyone to see, but can you just tell us a little bit about yourself and what you think you'd like this audience to know about you? So Heather.
Well, my name is Heather Walken. I live in the Similkamee Valley. I am in the territory of the Okanagan. This is not my territory. My territory is Northern Vancouver Island, the Kwagilth Nation. And I work in a number of areas in disability justice and also human rights work. I've worked in design for over 30 years, including design, accessible design throughout the world, from war-torn spaces to places that no one will ever hear of, and working on supporting people and how they manage their lives as people with disabilities. Yuta?
Thank you, Heather and Isha. So I'm coming to you from Toronto, the territories of the Mississauga and the Credit. And I'm the director of something called the Inclusive Design Research Center, which I started back in 1993. And if I were to boil down our primary focus, it's to make sure that emerging technologies and their associated social practices are designed to be inclusive of the full range of human difference. And my primary qualification is that I have about 40 years of making mistakes and learning from them under my belt. And so I see what part of my role in helping others learn from the mistakes that I've made.
Thank you. So let's get started with with a few questions, and I'm going to start us off. So we're here today to talk about issues of accessibility, universal design, inclusive design, terms that we know about. We may work in an area that we think about and employ those terms all the time, or they may just still be concepts that we haven't given a lot of thought to. But it seems important that we understand the concepts before we think about so we can figure out where we want to go and how to talk about where we want to go. So if I could, I'll just start by, we know that the United Nations definition of accessibility is that it is best defined as the provision of flexibility to accommodate each user's needs and preferences. And when used with reference to persons with disabilities, any place, space, item, or service, whether physical or virtual, that is easily approached, reached, entered, existed, interacted with, understood, or otherwise used by persons of varying disabilities is considered to be accessible. Quite a mouthful. I'm going to turn to you first, Yuta, to maybe talk to us a little bit about what you think these terms mean: accessibility, universal design, and inclusive design.
Sure, thank you. So one thing to note is that all standard traditional forms of design, planning, decision-making are biased against diversity and tend to reduce complexity, almost by design. Even design thinking competitively arrives at a winning or best design, meaning there's winners and losers in the choices that are made. And most design prioritizes the largest customer base, the average or the typical. And here I'm talking about the traditional forms of design. So this is where these forms of design that you've listed come in. One thing to know is that of all the human groupings, people with disabilities are the most diverse group. The only common characteristic of people with disabilities from a requirements or a data perspective is sufficient distance from the norm that things are not designed for you or with you in mind. Disability is also a universal condition. We will all experience disability eventually, whether it is a loved one or ourselves. And disability is also part of every other marginalized group. This bias against diversity, variability, and complexity that is found in our current standard forms of design is at the root of rising disparity and indirectly the cause of many of the crises we're experiencing right now. You've given the definition of accessibility. Often people view accessibility as a set of criteria to enable access by people with disabilities. While accessibility is the criteria for access, inclusive design is about the process of designing to include the full spectrum of human difference. This is done with people with lived experience of the margins because they have the most valuable expertise. They're aware of the cracks in our system, the first to feel the effects of the crises to come, the least complacent and comfortable and most willing to change the current design, and the most aware of possible alternatives or real innovation. Because of the diversity of perspectives at the margin, and because at the margins you can't trust popularity, simple answers exclude you, and life is so much more unpredictable. People with experience of the margins are more familiar with and experienced with navigating complexity. So those things that the other forms of design are denying or ignoring are not lost within an inclusive or universal design. designing with people at the margins not only creates systems that work at the margins, it creates systems that work better with our current reality, because we are currently in a whole set of entangled crises. So you might ask, the one part of the question that I haven't addressed is, what's the difference between inclusive design and universal design? Universal design comes out of architecture and industrial design. It aims to create a one-size-fits-all design for the largest range of people based on the 7 principles of universal design. The Canadian School of Inclusive Design came out of digital design and networks, realizing that you can offer an integrated one-size-fits-one experience within an adaptable system. But this needs to be done proactively from the very start and is a continuous process. The process of inclusive design can be applied to everything you design, from policies to services to cities and, of course, to recreation, which is where we're at.
Thanks, Yuda. That's a great way to get us started thinking about the concept. I'll just alert everyone. I put a question in the chat on reading it. I said, tell us about yourselves. What are your biggest concerns? And I suppose I should qualify that with, not really looking for your biggest concerns in life, but as they relate to issues of accessibility and inclusive design. Are you encountering those kinds of questions or issues in your work? Let us know what that is, and we can try to make sure that our panelists talk about it. So I'm going to move
accessibility can link to almost all of your concerns. So it could
exactly
be concerns in life. So
that's true.
Top of mind.
That is, I didn't want to start asking you if, the soup was too hot for lunch or getting into, so I thought I'd qualify it. I'll turn to you, Heather. Tell us a little bit, feel free to comment on the differences in these concepts. And then from there, maybe tell us a little bit about what do you think we're working towards? What are we trying, where are we trying to get? Because maybe if we know that, it'll be easier to figure out the process along the way.
You mean, where is nirvana? That's always my goal, is nirvana. I would like to get up in the morning, manage my life, walk out the door, and not have people comment on the fact I'm blind. I would like to be able to use my cane in an accessible way when I am outside my home, and it is seen to be just normal. I would like to walk into a store with my guide dog and not be told I have to leave. That's my goal of accessibility, and just be a regular person. When you're blind, it's very hard to be stealth. Everybody hears the tap, tap, tap. Everybody sees the dog. Everybody sees you becoming tactile. And I wanted to build on something that Yuta said, because I think it's very important when we are looking at this. And I encourage you all to look at your own ingredients of how you view life, what your biases are, how were you brought up, what is your living experience, how have you interacted with space and how you move through space and use things around you, and how have you managed through attitudes towards you. Because one of the things is, for me, I'm okay the way I am. I'm blind, perfectly fine with me. It's the attitude and the environment that disable me. So let's be clear about that. I'm not inherently something wrong with me. And when we talk about these things, we forget that we are people, and we start looking at the disability as the issue. And that's where we set up a system that really is built for the norm. And we are somehow thought to be outside the norm. We also look at accommodation. That has to also come in to the terms we're using around accessibility and accessible spaces and universal design. Accommodation has been made for many, many people in this world, in Canada. How we built our houses, how we function, how we view the world, has all been done accommodating a certain group of people, but did not include all of us. And so when we talk about accommodation, we're not talking about something extra, different, unique. We're saying you didn't include us in the first run of developing our society. Now you need to. How do you do that? And so for sighted people, one of the things I've always thought was interesting was when I asked someone at a previous conference, how many streetlights do you think are out there in Canada? And they said, oh, probably millions. And I said, yeah. And why do we have them? And it's, well, so you're safe at night when you walk down the street and you don't drive your car into bushes and stuff. And I said, yeah. I said, that's an accommodation, right? That we have streetlights. And they said, yeah. I said, my accommodation is tactile. I need to know they don't help me navigate a street. Well, I need tactile for my cane or markers for my dog to find things. And so the idea that only people with disabilities need an accommodation when we already have accommodated a large percentage of society is really important to remember. Sometimes I say to people in a big conference, I'll stand up and say, you know, if the lights go out, I'll be your best friend because I know how to navigate this room. You probably don't know. So listen to my voice if that happens. So the thing I'm bringing forward is that we have different ways of how we view disability, and it needs to start with the person because we're not all the same. And so that's the concept I would like within the accommodation, within universal design and inclusive design, to start thinking about that. What is your attitude? How do you look at things? What scares you? What makes you feel comfortable to work with people with disabilities, and to include them in the human race, because that's where the problem has been.
So Yuda, given what Heather's talking about in terms of thinking about the person, thinking about accommodation and how there are accommodations made all the time for people for a number of reasons. How does that impact how you look at or how you think we should be looking at universal design? What do you think of that idea that accommodation is already embedded in so many things we do?
Right. And I like Heather's reframing of accommodation, because accommodation has always seemed to be a problematic word because it implies that there is the standard process, and then there's this add-on or this additional leniency or whatever that's provided. And I love how you flip that. Accommodations needed when we haven't done the design right in the first place is often what I say. And the way that we approach universal design is understanding that the most valuable experts to bring into the design process are the people that can't use or have difficulty with the current design. Because one of the things to know within coming from design, and if if we're heading towards nirvana or a system that actually works for human difference and complexity, and therefore also will work for us when we are feeling in crisis or in need of accommodation, it's best to bring people who are not complacent and comfortable and can assume that the world is going to work, because they are less likely to change. Inclusive design, universal design, accessibility, unfortunately, require a huge culture shift. But that culture shift is a culture shift that is going to benefit us all. And that's a lesson that I think we're all starting to learn during this pandemic, because we know things like that none of us are safe unless all of us are safe. None of us are free unless all of us are free. And so in order to meet even the small goals, or the larger inclusive design goals that head towards that nirvana, we need to step out of the sort of the comfortable, complacent, privileged area that we currently live in, and think about what we need to do from the perspective of the people that cannot use or have difficulty with the current system we're in. So I think to some extent you were going to ask about consultation as well, or perhaps that was embedded in your question. One of since I brought up consultation, there are these issues as well within universal design and inclusive design and accessibility, the issues of representation and consultation. How do you actually engage people in the design process? And one of the unfortunate things that's happened lately with the increased popularity of DEI and the buzz around equity and inclusion efforts is that there are these unfortunate faux inclusive design or faux DEI efforts that are springing up, where there's this false belief that anyone with a specific label can represent the needs of everyone else with the same label. And what you need is co-design with as diverse a group of individuals as possible. The goal is not to delineate the outcomes, but to co-design a process and create, well, it's to delineate the outcomes, but also largely to co-design the process and create the adaptation and responsiveness in the designs that you're creating. And I'm being very theoretical, but what I mean by that is, frequently what happens is we bring in a group of individuals and we say, here's our design. Is it accessible? Can you give us the stamp of approval? Can you certify that it's accessible? And when we've already predetermined the solution. And then there's many issues with that. First of all, we needed to have engaged those individuals in the problem framing. We needed to have engaged those individuals in figuring out what is the most inclusive approach to the problem that's there. And if we put those individuals as the gatekeepers of whether the design goes ahead or doesn't go ahead, then that sets up this friction. It sets up anyone with a disability or anyone representing the excluded group as the reason why there's more cost or there's a delay or why we can't go ahead with the design, which is a fairly untenable and difficult situation to put people in. So
I'd like to talk about that a little bit too, Yuta. The idea that others know best for us and that power imbalance is really something to look at yourself. That if someone walked into your living room and decided for you how your house was going to be, and just by the way, what do you think? Does it work for you? And it's too late to change it because the premise has already been defined by people who may not know where to start. I remember when I did have vision, before I gained my blindness, there was a little 4-character cartoon or 4-box cartoon where the kids wanted a swing. Then the consultants got a hold of it. Then the politicians got a hold of it. And then the people with the money got a hold of it. And it ended up, they couldn't have it because it was going to cost too much because the consultants built a crazy thing. So while the kids were waiting for the adults to get it together, they found an old tire and some rope and hung it from a tree and they had their swing. And sometimes the simplest thing is the accommodation. It's not necessarily the big thing. It's just, I just want to know where the bathroom is. And when we talk about COVID, I wanted to bring this up because this is where I don't know how many of you see the apparently they're round things in the supermarkets and the stores that tell you where to stand and how far 6 feet is. Well, I can't see those. And I've been yelled at many times about how dare you cross over these things. They're not tactile. My cane doesn't pick them up. I cannot tell you the amount of blood I have shed in the last year hitting plexiglass, because all of a sudden what wasn't there before, all of a sudden is there. All these rules about, if I go into the bank, there's rules posted about how to enter, wait, where to go, what to do. Everywhere has become visual. How to manage COVID has become visual. Doesn't help me. And what happens is now I have to rely on others to keep me safe. I have to rely on others to stay 6 feet away, hope they're wearing a mask. So all of a sudden, my vulnerability jumped up way higher than it was before COVID. And so those are the kinds of things that happen automatically, but then that tend to isolate people in the disability community. And those are serious design errors in how we did not plan for a response to a pandemic or even an earthquake. We're not involved in the emergency planning of what we need. And had many of us not known people with disabilities or landlords remembering that somebody was in a wheelchair and their workers weren't coming and we got police checks, many more people would have died as a result of dehydration and being left in their beds, because there was all of a sudden everything collapsed and there was no way to manage, and nobody thought about that. So these are the kinds of things. I've got something to say later about recreation, how to look at recreation. We'll get there, believe me, we'll get there.
And one of the questions, so I'm happy to see there's some questions coming up in the chat. And so one, Heather, is that question about someone's asking you to share a recreation program that you were involved in that was good, and why was it good, and maybe why was it not so good? Do you want to answer that now, or do you want to wait? And I've got a question for you.
Yeah, go ahead. Keep going, and we can get back to that one.
Okay, and then we've got some more that I'll pepper you
And
with
I
coming
can
in.
answer the cost one.
Okay, so Heather, I'm going to ask you this, and then we'll let you to answer the question about budget cuts. So Heather, Yuta had just talked to us a bit about consultation and engagement, and we saw you nodding at many of the things that she was saying about, what works and what doesn't work. And so I just turn it to you. Tell us about what consultation feels like when it's done right. What are some things that we can take away? What it feels like when it's not going the way that you think it should. Because I think we can all learn a little bit from that.
For me, if I walk into my recreation center and I say, hi, I'm interested in doing something, and the recreation center says, oh, well, we have people that will look after that. And you can meet with them and talk about that, because maybe there's a large low vision and blind community around that I know of that I bring to you. Access to decision-making is good consultation. A lot of it comes from us, should come from us, or at least you bring a space open for us to have that conversation with each other around what might work for us. Sometimes when we're so bent on, oh, we've got to get a program for this group or for that group, we'll bring them in, we'll mine their information, we'll set up the program on their behalf. It's not good co-creation, and that's not meaningful and empowering consultation. So when you look at, okay, who's not getting served in your recreation programs and who is in your community, feel free to go and say, are there things we can do and what are they? Rather than think you're in charge of, or you have to take on all that responsibility to do good for everybody. People will let you know, nah, I'm not really interested in recreation. I get enough workout just, walking my dog or wheeling in my wheelchair. And then you might find a group of people go, yeah, I really like curling. And I'm very familiar with blind curling. And you go, okay, we can get 6 people together, sit down, talk about doing a blind curling group. Those are the kinds of ways you interact that is meaningful consultation, meaningful bringing in people into those spaces. If people know they're welcome to bring ideas forward, and you put that out in all of community, somebody will take you up on that. And for me, that's sort of a practical way to go about it. That's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. I think we can all think about that, just how we even approach the question. Yuta, there was a question in the chat, someone asking everyone else, have you had to cut inclusive design ideas at your recreation facility due to budget cuts? I haven't heard a response, but I think you may have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. There's this complete misconception that inclusive design costs more. In fact, what we found is it saves money. And that may sound unreal, or you may push against that, but we actually have looked at what happens when you consider the full range of needs right from the beginning. So not just design for the majority and then think, oh, well, we'll deal with accessibility or the needs of the people that are not actually part of our visitors right now anyways, after the fact. And what we see, whether it's service design or whether it's architectural design or program design, is that is going to cost you, because if you don't include the full spectrum of individuals right from the beginning in an integrated way, you'll have far more help that you need to provide. There will be all sorts of things that will arise, which will cause you to have to patch on alternative strategies. Your system will not be, or whatever it is that you're designing, will not be sufficiently flexible or amenable to the changes and the unexpected things. As where if you start right at the beginning of thinking of how do I make this thing that I'm designing work for the largest range of individuals, and especially the people that have experience of being marginalized at the moment, then you're going to create a much more flexible design. It is going to be able to respond to the changes and the unexpected things that come up. You'll need far less help, you'll need far less maintenance, and you won't have to keep patching on or modifying the system that you're designing. And that applies to programming. It applies to how people book time or enlist in programs. It applies to your website. It applies to almost everything that you're designing. So, and if someone in the administration tells you that we don't have enough money for inclusive design, not having enough money and being in a budget crunch is actually the best reason there is to inclusively design from the beginning, because you will save money in the just beyond the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term.
I'd like to pick up on that quickly, Isha, because one of the things we tend to do is only design around the users, the people coming into your rec centers, the people coming into your programs, but we don't design around the people who may be employed and who come from the disability community. It's still considered an anomaly to have somebody in your rec center that actually plays basketball in a wheelchair, or someone like me who can do all sorts of interesting things because of how I can listen. And so one of the things to do is also take a look at who are your colleagues and who do they represent? And are they representing the people you want to bring in? And so start looking at the whole chain of events of people with disabilities also going through school and getting training. to work in the recreation area. I mean, I know Blind Sports Manitoba. I'm more familiar with Blind Sports in BC. There's a number of other groups that work with disability and sports. There's a number of ways to approach it that can be bringing people in when the decision and discussion is happening, who have the lived, and I always say, and living experience, because I'm not gone yet. And I include people as colleagues in that. And so also look around at who is missing, who is not representative. And do not use the word able-bodied. We are all able-bodied. All our bodies are able to do what they can do. And that's important. And one fact I think you need to also know is 24% of the population of Canada has identified with a disability that we're aware of. Other people have never gotten on the list to say they also identify with a disability. So that's 1/4 of our population of Canada that is shut out. And that's important to remember.
So I'm going to ask you a question. Both of you, I'm going to throw a question back at you based on what you said. So first, Yuta, you talked about design and how we should think about these things from the beginning, at the outset when we're designing, and then we, it saves money, and there's a myth out there about cost. So assuming that many recreational facilities are old infrastructure, they're old buildings, it's hard to move walls, there's, who knows. Does your advice or your thoughts on that change? Does it, with respect to cost and how we approach those discussions about cost?
Well, certainly retrofitting costs more than designing right from the beginning, right? But what we find is that if you have to prioritize what you're going to be fixing, I mean, the fact that you're in a situation where you have to fix things means you haven't done it very well right at the beginning. It shows the flaws. And the fact that you are in this state of having to fix something, the way to choose the priorities is to address the needs at that point of the people that experience the greatest difficulty or are excluded from the design. So if you've gotten yourself in a situation where you have to retrofit, then retrofit with the very edge of the individuals that are currently excluded. I work largely in the digital space, and one of the things we figured out is there's absolutely no way to really retrofit a digital system once it's out there. It morphs. It's like a genie that's escaped from the bottle, and you're not going to stuff it back in. It propagates all over the place. So there's no way to really retrofit it. So you have to do it proactively. Of course, architecture is different, but lots of people reduce what it means to be accessible or to be inclusive to wheelchairs and to walls and doorways, which is that's the most, well, it's a very, very reduced sense of that. And by virtue of reducing it, we also make it so much more critically important than many of the other things, which are part of the whole package. So yes, it'll cost something to put in a ramp, but it would have been even better or less costly if when the place was built, you didn't need stairs, or there were other alternatives to the barriers that you've created in your architecture. I don't know, Heather probably has lots to say about, yeah.
Well, one of the areas, of course, it is going to cost you more to retrofit, but the cost to the economy of keeping 1/4 of the population out of society is a lot higher cost. And although it isn't in your budget, the federal government doesn't say, okay, here's the portion that we would have spent on maintaining people in abject poverty. Here's some money to your recreation center to make sure they can get there. That doesn't happen. But you need to look at from that more larger. And as you just said, talk to the people who are the most marginalized to get in. I mean, people say, oh, sometimes we bring up all the issues, but as my friend Stella Young said on her TED Talk, no amount of smiling at a set of stairs is going to produce a ramp. No amount of, meditation in a library will produce a braille. And so we have to look at also where the contributions come in when we look at retrofitting. For instance, I want to bring up Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C. It is a university designed and developed by deaf people. And they're taking out all their stairs, so there's ramps, because when deaf people speak, they use their hands and they're looking at each other. And that's part of the language of the deaf. Having stairs breaks that up. Things like no more corners. When you walk down a hallway at Gallaudet, there are no corners. When you get to the corner, it's actually cut. So you can see people coming from different directions. When they have a bulletin board, they put like aluminum foil around it. So if someone's walking by or coming up behind you, you can't hear them, but you can see that change. And so you know someone's coming. They've also opened up all their floors to open. So you could lean down, and if people are sitting in the next level down at a table talking, you could actually join the conversation because you can hear what they're saying through being able to observe their signing. And so just conceptually, how we move through space is really important. And there's a lot of little things that can happen like that. You can't cut off the corner in the hallway. Put up one of those concave mirrors so you can see what's coming and who's coming. And that just little fixes like that can make a huge difference in accessibility. It doesn't have to be, a $40,000 ramp. There may be another way to get someone in an acceptable and not demeaning way into the building. But
I love how Heather has been framing it. I mean, who's bearing the cost at the moment? People with disabilities are bearing the cost of those barriers. We've basically what we've done as a society is we've pushed the costs to a group of individuals that are already below the poverty line. Recreation services, public services, all of the things that we design as a society are supposed to serve our entire population. And when we use the excuse, well, it costs too much, basically what we're saying is we as a public are not going to pay for this. You as an individual who experiences the barrier will have to bear the cost of this. And so the infuriating thing as well is I've been listening to the chatter about the promised Canada disability benefit, and people are talking about, oh, do people need another handout or this sort of thing, which is just so infuriating because basically we're paying a debt. We're paying because to date, what we've done is we've asked people with disabilities to bear the cost of all of these shortcuts that we've taken, or these misdesigns, these bad designs of our services, our buildings, our programs, etc. So I think we really need to rethink any argument where we're saying accessibility costs too much or inclusive design costs too much.
I'd also go ahead, Isha.
No, you go first.
I was going to say, let's also talk about contributions from people in the disability community. I don't know if you know where a typewriter comes from. Mm-hmm. One of the places that a typewriter came from was a man who was in love with a woman who was blind. And he wanted to send him love notes. So he designed he was Italian and very passionate, and he designed a typewriter so they could have an affair going and send.
Windsurf designed email to be able to communicate with his wife. So that's what you can think. Yeah, almost every disruptive innovation was motivated by addressing the needs of someone with a disability.
That's right. And we, people use photocopiers. I guess they're not using them, but scanners and all that technology and keyboarding, all that came from people who were innovating around disability, and everyone took it over. I mean, you can pick up your iPhone now and tell Siri to send a text and to do an email back and forth. That came from us and our work with Apple to make sure those were in there. Those kinds of innovations, and that's the thing about universal design is the hidden thing. We all benefit when we have it. I would venture to guess every person at this in this workshop has used a ramp. Well, ramps are used by everybody, not just someone in a chair. And so it's really important to look at when we talk about universal design, it isn't just about a person with a disability. It's what's best for all of us and impacts all of us.
So I'm going to go back to a question to you, Heather, and then I'm going to make sure that we talk about two things before we wrap up. One is about recreation programs and some personal experiences. So keep that, both of you think about those things. But I want to go back to the comments that you made about what good consultation looks like, and to look around in your organization, who are your colleagues? And I'm going to hazard a guess, because if we look at the statistics, we know about the rates of employment for people with disabilities, that many will say I don't work with anyone who has a disability, and I want to do this work. I want to figure out whether it's the concave mirrors or whether it's something in a program that will make it more accessible, but I don't have anybody to ask. What do you say to those people? How do you find the people who you want to work with?
Yeah, how do you find a blind person? Phone up Blind Sports. You want to find people in wheelchairs? Go to Paralympics and find all the people who have ever gone through Paralympics, and you'll find swimmers and experts in sledge hockey. I mean, I was so fortunate to be in BC when the Paralympics were in BC. What was that, 2010? I was a volunteer at the sledge hockey, and it was like the most exciting hockey game anybody had ever seen. And so there are already disability organizations and groups. Start there. Start with the people who are already in the biz of recreation with people with disabilities. And that will bring you an incredible worldwide group of people who've done a lot of work on this and can really support you at a community level to gain knowledge, and local people to engage with. Skiing for Light is another one where we cross-country ski, and every year we go to, well, until COVID, we went to a different country and cross-country skied in Iceland and Norway, all over the world. We've cross-country skied, Colorado. And it's a group of blind people who have dog sitters. And when we go out, we have guides who help us go through the trails. And it's a fantastic program. Again, lots already happening, even though you may not know about it. But once you start Googling and you start looking, you will be shocked at the amount of knowledge and workarounds and people who have developed programs because they wanted to have a program that included them. Things like swimming. If you're blind, one of my friends was a Paralympian in Korea, and she said the biggest problem she's always had at public pools is they don't put ropes on both sides of the lane. She needs those to be able to keep track of being able to know, not veer off. Those are the kinds of things that simple things, a rope, an extra 100, 200 feet of rope changes her life. And those are simple things, but they again, it's about including the people who are already doing it sometimes. I don't know if you have dragon boat races down your river over there in Winnipeg, but we do out here in BC on the coast and on our bigger lakes. That's a whole other place too, of blind people and people in chairs that are dragon boating against each other. And it's quite cool.
So thank you. It's helpful. And I think sometimes we need to be pushed to do the most basic things, which is just start Googling, is what you just told us, and look at all the things that we'll find. So one of the questions that from the audience was remarking on was thanking you both to talk about for talking about the impact of COVID and COVID signage, and I think referring to some of the comments that you made, Heather. So do either of you have any options that would be good to have in parks and facilities now, while we're still living through this pandemic, that would make facilities more accessible for vision impaired individuals?
For vision impaired individuals specifically?
Yeah, or other, that was the question, but certainly feel free to remark on any other disability related needs.
Actually, I had a more generic engagement, and that was booking, because of course the restrictions booking into programs becomes even more restrictive, has become more restrictive at COVID, whether it's booking a time on a hockey rink or whatever. And one of the cities we work with releases the booking system or opens it up at like 6 a.m. in the morning. And it's always the parents or whatever that are most well-resourced, that have good internet, that are able to grab the first spots. And there's usually absolutely no information about what does it look like with respect to other than average or other than typical requirements. And so what we've been helping them to do is to provide that information, but then also one of the things that we frequently do in inclusive design is we hold this grandparent-grandchild conversation. Why? Why is it a competitive process which is first come, first serve? Why are these massive restrictions on certain programs such that only the individuals that have the best bandwidth and know to get, or have the time to get up at 6 a.m. and know about it, are going to get the spots? So it actually ended up re-looking at the entire program offerings, such that there was the programs where there were many requests and that were more amenable to a wider group of requirements and wants or desires regarding program, that those are the ones that received additional spots. So it provided an opportunity to just recalibrate what were the offerings, and everyone benefited from that. There was less bad feelings, less competition, less complaints, and it didn't cost any more, because the opening of offerings was balanced out by the reduction in offerings that were not as competitively wanted. But that's just one example. But Heather, you probably have more direct examples that relate to the question.
I think when you're designing systems at all, if you're designing a recreation system and you want to include people with disabilities, just from the get, know the bus system. The majority of us don't drive. So we're going to have to get a bus to that event. Are those buses, not all buses are equal, and not every city or town has an accessible bus or handy dart to get there. So you've got to also think about not just, we did a fantastic job, we've got an accessible building, we've really done our work around an accessible program, but no one can get there at that time of night because at 6 o'clock, all the buses that do have those lifting ramps don't come there, or they're so, where they do drop off could be up to a mile away that someone can't safely get there. And how do they get home if it's later at night? There's all those kind of considerations when you talk about accessibility. How do you get there from here? And there was one other thing I wanted to say about this, and it's just dropped out of my head, but I do want to tell you my story about one of the most, two things. One was a program we set up. I come from an area where there's a lot of trauma, for whatever reason, trauma, and trauma in little children. And I've done this in different parts of the world for people who have fled war and are traumatized. And one of the things we started doing was using sports as a way to do therapy without doing therapy. So it was about starting with a basketball, bouncing the ball, and then popping it to the person or the child in this case, and see what they could do with it. And some children picked it up, some children, it took months, even years, before they felt like they could play with the ball. And then you started to build skill. How can you get the ball to spin on your finger? How do you get it to go under your leg? How do you run down the court with the ball? It took the time. We had the space and the time that it wasn't on our time. It was on the child's time. How long was it going to take? As long as the child needed. And that was something we look at, what we call crip time now, is that valuing the energy and the allowance of time to learn skills to be able to participate, and doing it in the person's, start where the person is at, not where you want them to be, and give them the time, even if it takes a year before people start to feel comfortable about being with people who do not look like them or relate the way they do. So with these children, what we did was, over time, as they built skills and confidence and weren't scared, to maybe have a buddy. And then they worked with each other, passing the ball and then creating some competition. Oh, I can get to the other end faster than you, or I can get that ball up into the net. And so build confidence. And we slowly in some places in Turkey, where I worked, helping develop 43,000 person community, a tented community of people coming out of Syria. It took quite a long for many of the children, and as it rolled into young adults and older adults, everybody started to play basketball. But there was no rules around it. People were going up and down the court, but they finally got to be able to just share and relate to each other. And that helped reduce the trauma. And it was through sports we did that. But we didn't necessarily put a whole bunch of rules in place at the beginning, because we wanted people to just get used to being able to feel good about themselves with the ball, good about having a buddy. Then we had 3 people, and it just slowly grew from that. And that was working with trauma and sports. So that's one instance of something that was very powerful to me, of the beauty of inclusion, the beauty of working with people where they're at, and nobody controlling it, just given time, energy, and space for someone to create that within themselves, that confidence. I don't know if that's helpful, but that was very powerful to me.
It is helpful. It's helpful when we hear both of you talk about it in a way that inspires us to go back to our places of work and just find the little things that we can do and maybe try to mobilize some big things that we can do. And I know that everyone on this call has joined because we're looking for those big and small things that and so you've left lots of nuggets in your answers to those questions. I'm mindful of the time and also want to make sure there's still time in case there's any other questions. So use the chat or use the Q&A function and we'll get that question. But my question to you is, so I know you both from my work at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and because you are members of our Inclusive Design and Accessibility Council amongst a number of other people. And let's reflect for a moment on that work with the museum. And I can say we're really proud of the work that we've been able to do, in part with your guidance around accessibility and universal design. And so I hope people come to the museum and can experience that. But there's lots of work to do. There's lots of things that despite our best efforts, there are things that we've missed in the original concept or things that have come up that we didn't think about enough. And so it always tells me we'll continue to make mistakes. We're not going to get this right, but we got to keep working at it. My question to you is, can you think of one thing, small thing? You can give us a big thing as well, but at least just one small thing that we could take away and act on now. So maybe it's an approach, maybe it's something tangible. So in addition to all the things you've already shared, is there one thing that you could leave us with that we can take and do something with practically as we go back to our jobs? Drum roll, please.
One of the things that Australia did was they set aside $60 billion to change their cities and to be inclusive and accessible. This was a few years ago, and I've been involved with a number of groups there that have been doing that. And there were two areas that were really important. One was to observe how people use space. So rather than only maybe blindfolding yourself and see how you operate in your space in your home, or using a wheelchair or walker to get a sense of how that affects your joints and how that exhausts you, or how do you get to a bus, a floating bus stop without being killed by a biker who goes by. What they did was they had a two-way process, because that's usually the way they throw shades on you and say, okay, now experience for 5 minutes how a blind person works. But instead what they did was they had a large group of people who were informing engineers, everybody involved in the towns and cities, to actually observe how people use space. People with different disabilities were using space, were getting through to onto buses, using how they went down the sidewalks, how they got into buildings. Observe how people use space, and observe how they're not using it. That's also another way to maybe start on your journey, is see how people. You see a lot of elders walking with canes, with arthritis. How do they manage? Watch their faces when they have to step up on too high a curb, and how that feels for them. Get a sense of how others get out of your own place and look at how others are managing within those spaces. And that will give you a lot of information. Yuta?
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar. bring somebody that has a dissonant view, somebody that's currently missing, someone that's as different from you as possible, or as different when you look at the team that you're working in. What are the perspectives that are not represented in your team? And invite or engage difference, basically, and dissonance. And I'm not saying it's going to be an easy process, but it'll be a growing process, and it'll, in the long run, benefit everyone. And you were one of the things I think you intimated to in our earlier discussions was what are some of the good practices of the museum. And I think one of the things I appreciated is that many organizations that we work with view accessibility or inclusive design as a legal liability issue. And I really appreciated that that wasn't the perspective that the museum was coming at this from. This is not about following legal requirements. I mean, the legal requirements are a very sort of tragic last or way of dealing with the fact that people haven't done things in their own self-interest. Accessibility and inclusive design should be seen as an opportunity, as something that is going to benefit everyone, as Heather has so eloquently said earlier.
Yeah, I think, thanks for saying that, Yuta. I think that what you've told us, what you both sort of told us, is that we can't look at issues of accessibility and inclusive design from the perspective of just liability or compliance with legal or regulatory requirements. We've got to look at where we're going. Where do we want to be as a society? Who should be included? And if I think we're all here because we believe everyone should be included, then that's all those simple things, all those nuggets that you've left us with, that allow us to, I think, do that work. You wanted to say something, Heather?
Yeah, I was just thinking about, does everybody remember we used to have, before LEDs, we used to have those big lights. They were long and they fluorescent, I think they were called, and they buzzed.
Yeah.
And people would be in offices and come out like shaky after a day of that. And I was thinking about that because a number of the people I work with also have disabilities. Used to be called unseen, but if you observe someone long enough, you can see they're very seen. That anxiety producing light, anxiety producing things moving too fast can really keep people out of sort of the regular thing that we think of as group sports. And consider looking at low light. Consider looking at including people who it's just too much. And that a softer type of sport, it doesn't all have to be running, and it doesn't all have to be action-packed. Sports, I mean, yoga classes, I mean, just the whole breadth, just going for a walk and feeling comfortable with people is a huge part of for many of the people I work with, is like, wow, people are actually talking to me and saying hi, and they join a walking group. Like it doesn't have to be big, but it can meet needs that and meet people where they're at, and be comfortable with that. We're not trying to change a person's disability. We're not trying to force them to be like someone else, or what we're trying to do is be inclusive, and that comes us full circle to what inclusive is. And when you do read the design principles of universal design, remember when they were designed to be used together, not cherry pick one and say, okay, we hit one of the 7. They were meant as a process of looking at the greater good of each other. And I want to say to you too, as Yuta said at the beginning, I learned from my mistakes. I don't learn from my successes, because that's just gravy. I learn from when I screw up. I learn when I make a mistake. I learn when I wasn't paying attention. And I'm no perfect individual. And I don't speak on behalf of the blind community. I speak on me as Heather, as being in the blind community. And so what I may need at 65 is going to be totally different than a 15-year-old. But again, that's about going back to what we talked about, is having the people who have that lived and living experience talk to you and find those common grounds.
Thank you. Thank you both. This has been great. I learn something from you every time I have had a chance to speak with you. And I know that our audience will reflect on what you shared with us. So thank you for the open conversation and sharing, and just flowed. We said it would just flow the way it would, and it did. And I think it worked. So thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for being here, for listening. And I hope that you're able to take some of this away with you. And that's all. Happy weekend.
I'd like to remind everybody to fill out the session evaluation survey. And also closing remarks are next at 3:15. So please share or come along to hear those. Thank you very much.
And
thank you very much, Isha. Thank you, Judah. Thank you, Heather. And special thank you to Christina for being available today. Your assistance in this call has been immensely, immensely appreciated.
Right.
And there's a set of resources that we're leaving you with as well.
Yes, that will be shared with everyone, and it will be available in the description of this page. Hi, Christina. Thank you.